Good morning. My name is Tina Carter, and as a member of the African American Heritage Committee of the Chicago Public Library, welcome. For over 150 years, the Chicago Public Library has strived to provide opportunities and resources for our patrons near and far to read, learn, and discover. As we continue to offer welcoming places and spaces to discuss the lessons of our past in order to set forth our futures, we turn to the work and legacy of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. As a sociologist and historian, he became an activist who exposed the realities and dangers of racism as an advocate for African Americans and as an advocate for all of us. Johan will give you a little more information about the space that we are currently in and the work that brings us here today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to everyone for joining us. It's a beautiful thing to see so many new and familiar faces, and also welcome to everyone watching on the live stream. Some of you may not be familiar with Saturday Free School, but we're an organization that is predominantly based in Philadelphia, but we have a few people here in Chicago as well. And really, we're dedicated to developing ideas and knowledge for freedom. And we believe that this is a project that has to go outside of the walls of the university and academia. This year is 90 years of the book Black Reconstruction in America by W.E.B. Du Bois. And so we thought it was an important occasion to celebrate and educate about this very important work. And Du Bois is a central thinker for our work generally in the Saturday Free School. So I'm very thankful to be here in the Chicago Bee branch. I did a little bit of research and found out that the Chicago Bee newspaper, which was a historically black newspaper run by and founded by Mr. Anthony Overton, who was a prominent black businessman in the early 20th century. I found out that Du Bois actually had quite a close connection with the newspaper and with Mr. Overton. The newspaper often covered many of his works. Mr. Overton himself was actually born in Louisiana in 1865, technically a slave, and his father served as a Reconstruction legislator. So there's that connection. And in 1927, Du Bois actually successfully nominated Mr. Overton for the NAACP's highest medal, the Spingarn Award. And his speech, which is available online, is very interesting because Du Bois makes the argument that in the black social system, the entrepreneur can play a different role than a white monopoly capitalist and can actually be dedicated to the ideal of service for truth and beauty. And so Du Bois is a major figure. Black Reconstruction is a very important work. And Chicago is an important place. I actually found out we put together an Instagram post on our Saturday Free School Instagram and Facebook pages that has a lot of connections between Du Bois and the city of Chicago. Later in his life, when he was actually targeted by the U.S. government, and McCarthyism for his stances for world peace. It was many prominent people of Black Chicago that actually welcomed him here and celebrated his 90th birthday in a very prominent fashion. And a committee that included figures like Charlie and Margaret Burroughs, the founders of the Gustavo Museum, Charlie Hayes, a prominent Black trade unionist, and many others, welcomed him here, celebrated his 90th birthday, printed and published and promoted his works as essential to education in the society, and actually honored him with a program that was called W.E.B. Du Bois Man of the Century, which was very interesting. So it was an appropriate place to have a commemoration of this work. And I think there's no one better that I know than Dr. Anthony Monteiro to speak about W.E.B. Du Bois and his art and science. Before I turn it over to our speaker today, I would just like to say a few housekeeping things, which is that there are restrooms downstairs, and there's a restroom here which requires a key, which I'm put in charge of that key. They don't want to use that key. So if you would like to use that one, you can ask me. And we have refreshments, and we have a sign-in sheet, so please be sure to sign in before you head out. And again, thank you to the African American Heritage Committee for supporting this event, and thank you to the Chicago Bee branch, particularly Mr. Marvin, the branch librarian, for his support putting this together. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Monteiro.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming out. It's really an honor to be here uh, at this really historic site in this really historic part of Chicago. And I went to the University of Chicago, and I fell in love with Chicago, although I must say that I don't recognize Chicago, especially the South Side, and this part of the South Side, uh, which, you know, has given so very much to the struggle for Black freedom and world peace. It really has. And for the organizing of the unorganized workers, the labor movement. And so I'm just more than honored to be here and to have the opportunity to speak on Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America on the occasion of its 90th birthday, an event that should be celebrated. And it is a tribute to this branch of the Chicago Public Library that we are doing it here. And as I understand, Ida B. Wells was a prominent figure, and I think she had an office in this very building. So it's an honor to be here. The occasion of the 90th birthday of the publication of Black Reconstruction in America should be widely celebrated. But like Du Bois, it is not. The Organization of American Historians are meeting here, and one would have thought that the entire conference would have been turned over to such a celebration, given that Du Bois in Black Reconstruction speaks to this moment and the crisis of the American Empire, but it was not. But there was a panel which was attended by a good number of people at the conference, organized by my friend Johan and Wyatt, both from the Carnegie University in Pittsburgh. So, but it was a very interesting conversation. I guess I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I'll say this nonetheless. Du Bois does not belong to the academy. And if you ask me, I would say the academy doesn't want Du Bois. And I would further say that is probably a good thing. Du Bois belongs to the people of the world. He belongs to the ages. He is a man of the future. The American University is an institution of the past. So today we are here to not only acknowledge this great work, but to think in futuristic terms about where we and humanity are going at this time of crisis. I'm often thinking about how to begin. Beginnings are the most difficult part of giving a presentation, believe me. Uh, Let me perhaps begin here. Du Bois is a prequel to the future. He is not a sequence from the European 19th century. Let me explain what I mean by this, and I'll try to substantiate it as we go along. There is no question that the rise of European modernity was a great occasion for humanity. Capitalism, which is a part of modernity, it is not modernity itself, as Karl Marx said, came into the world with blood and mud all over it. However, there is more to what we call modernity than the economic system that is identified or associated with it. In this regard, the rise of modern European philosophy, especially the German 19th century, and particularly the philosophers Immanuel Kant, George Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel, and Karl Marx, are central figures in not only presenting philosophical arguments, but in guiding the development of science itself. In fact, it was Hegel who said that philosophy is the science of sciences. I mention this because Du Bois said over and over again, from the beginning of his academic career, that he intended to put science into sociology in order to answer the most profound questions of the modern epoch. In this regard, he would say that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, which means more than the words would suggest. Well, let me just say, substitute crisis for the word problem. Substitute modernity for the word 20th century. Hence, the crisis of modernity is the crisis of race and racial oppression, and not just in the United States. This is highly significant in understanding Du Bois as a prequel, and let me explain what I mean by the word prequel. It is kind of the opposite of sequential. A prequel comes after, but explains everything that came before it. So if we take the great traditions of philosophy that I just mentioned, and pretty much German philosophy in the 19th century, a lot of it associated in the end with Karl Marx and his great scientific achievements, but it is Du Bois and his work, and in particular, Black Reconstruction in America, that explains and completes Karl Marx, but explains the German classical philosophers of Kant and Hegel. Most people would say, well, that's an insane proposition. How could Du Bois, who was a Black man who never taught in a great American or European university, who was silenced for a good part of his life by his own government and by the racialization of knowledge, how could he explain Karl Marx, Kant, and Hegel? And how dare you, or me, as you would say, compare Du Bois to the greatest thinkers of European philosophy? How is that possible? I hope to explain it as we go forward. I think that, as I've said, Du Bois explains the greatest thinkers of modernity, the German philosophers. In the process, or in the course of doing this, he invents modern social science. It did not exist before him. Unlike the European modern thinkers who said that the project of modern philosophy was to discover the laws of natural and social realities, law. Du Bois would say, in a robust challenge to what became known as positivism, that part of social science which said to discover the truth of society, we had to do something like was being done in biology or physics. And so a lot of things developed, which in the end justified racial oppression, the slave trade, and colonialism, under the guise of having discovered the laws of social development. This idea of laws of social development, which became deeply enmeshed in Karl Marx's theory and the claims of Marxists, not unjustified, that what social science, in order to be a guide to revolutionary action, must do is to discover, and this phrase is very important, the laws of social development. What Du Bois says at the beginning of the 20th century, that when it comes to human beings and human societies, there is both law and chance. Law and that which defies laws of social development. He would say that, in fact, he writes this in the book Dusk of Dawn, his second autobiography in 1940. He says that when it comes to human society, chance, or what is not rationally explained, is as if not more important than law. That if you take motives that drive people to create systems of racial and colonial oppression, and the practices, the customs, the ideas, the values which sustain them, you cannot explain this or these phenomenon by law or reason. Pretty much as economics tries to do even up to this day, to find the laws of economy. So he discovers that for sociology and for social science, we must know both law and chance, law and probability, law and unreason in the affairs of human beings. In this respect, Du Bois had to undo the great architecture of 19th century European and German philosophy. He had to undo it, and not in the ways that we associate with academics doing critical undoing of ideas that they think are incorrect. He did it by the practice of explaining the color line and racial oppression in the United States. In other words, he undid the architecture of not only the social sciences of the 19th century, but the philosophies and epistemologies which underpin them. He did that by doing an alternative social science. Now, what were those epistemologies? What were those philosophies? And why did he have to transgress them in order to discover the truths of America and European oppression and the color line? Well, first of all, he had to assert that Black people were human beings. Well, today we more or less accept that, but back then that was an extraordinary and transgressive claim. What do you mean Black people are human? Have you lost your mind? But he had to assert that. But he also had to say, and he says this at the beginning of Souls of Black Folk, I am flesh of the flesh and bone of the bone of those within the veil. I am studying Black people as a Black person, and in so doing, I have foregone any sense that I am an objective scientist. Now, I think this is very important to the epistemology that, or the philosophy of knowledge that he will develop. To say not only are Black people human, but I'm a Black man who will use sociology that I will remake into a science to study my own people. I am bone of the bone and flesh of the flesh of those within the veil. So, for example, let me give you an example. You know, so often, if you meet an academic these days, he or she does not live with or too close to ordinary Black people. That person usually doesn't think like or know ordinary Black people. And it's almost a requirement of the academic, social, and cultural world, which is, of course, dominated by white elites and white academics who always have this racial gaze when judging Black folk. And it's an interesting dance because the Black people know they're being observed by their white elite friends, but they know they're being observed and so on through a racial gaze. And the Black person usually, to advance in university discourse and university hierarchies, has to act like they know how the game is played. But Du Bois says at the beginning of the 20th century, I am bone of the bone of those within the veil. And he writes like it. He thinks like it. His career is intentionally to get closer to Black people. You know, he was from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. His mother's side of the family was the dark-skinned side. They were brought to New York through the Dutch slavers. His father was the light-skinned side. And his father was Haitian, called Haitian Creole, light-skinned Haitian. His father happened to be, for whatever reasons, and we don't know, in Great Barrington, and entered into a relationship, a romantic relationship with his mother. And they conceived W.E.B. Du Bois. And the way I see the story, her family said, "You're gonna marry that girl." So the child has a name. And he did, but then he moved on. And Du Bois never knew his father. But my point is that here he is in New England, isolated from most Black people, although there was a Black community there. And when he decides he wants to go to college, he tells his relatives, his mother and those, "I want to go south. I want to go to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee." And they said, "Oh no, you can't go down south." You know, I know, being from Philadelphia, my family is from South Carolina, and I was scared to death to go down south. You know what I'm saying? Because it was different and so on. But he goes to Fisk University and he studies philosophy. But then after graduating from Fisk, he says he wants to go to Harvard and get a graduate degree. And he is admitted, but they tell him, "You have to redo your undergraduate degree." And of course, he being very prideful, some people even say arrogant, he did it, but he would always insist, "I was at Harvard, I was not of Harvard." But when he talks about Fisk, he was at Fisk and he was of Fisk. And while he was at Fisk, he taught in Wilson County, which was, the rural county, which was as close to slavery as you could get at that time. He taught in that community. And in a famous essay in Souls of Black Folk on the meaning of progress, he talks about this wonderful woman named Josie. He immortalizes her as a representative of the tenacious striving of Black people to educate themselves and to get some land so they could farm. But I say all of that to say that Du Bois, and we see this working out in his life, he was always attempting to get closer to ordinary Black people. This is part of an epistemology. Epistemology is a word that means a philosophy of knowledge. What can we know? And what are the methods that we use to know the world? And at the core of science itself and sociology as a science is the question of knowledge. And these two questions he is working out, which makes it such a drama to see it. That one, to show and constantly prove to a doubting and hostile world that Black people are human, that slavery had not diminished our humanity. And secondly, to understand Black folk, and by understanding Black folk, to understand humanity itself. This was a scientific endeavor of uncharted dimension, and he took it on. This is not small. And the world was changed. The world has been changed. If you take the world at the beginning of the 20th century and you look at it today, no one would make a claim that was made by, for example, Herbert Spencer, the great so-called social scientist who wrote 10 volumes known as synthetic philosophy. I guess every volume almost said the same thing, but the 10 volumes was so daunting that no one would dare challenge it. But no one, except people who are not in their right minds, would stand by the claims of Herbert Spencer. But the world acknowledges the truth that Du Bois presented in the earliest part of the 20th century. So already he began to change the world and to ask the question, what can we know and how do we go about knowing it? An issue that is still before us at this time. At this moment, early in his life, he was a revolutionary of knowledge. I wish to maybe return to this. There are a lot of people, usually young people, who are impatient, who say or believe that to be a revolutionary is to do something. To be an activist is to be a revolutionary. Du Bois said that the highest form of revolutionary achievement is knowledge. But then, for me, I began to understand the quest of Du Bois better when I was preparing for a lecture at the Central Branch of the Free Library in Philadelphia. And I thought that I knew Du Bois. I'd written a couple of articles on the art and science of Du Bois. I'd even written on Du Bois as a philosopher and as an epistemologist. But then as I tried to prepare for this, I realized I didn't know as much as I thought I knew. So I'm trying to work this science and art out. And I suddenly run across an essay that Du Bois wrote in 1890 when he was an undergraduate at Harvard. He was 22 years old. And he talked about the great Renaissance artist, Leonardo da Vinci. Okay, so now I was looking at Du Bois most of the time in relationship to 19th century European philosophy. Suddenly, I run across this essay entitled Leonardo da Vinci as a Scientist. And I'm thrown back now to the Renaissance, the earliest moments of European modernity, not the high points of European modernity, not the modernity of Hegel and Kant and Marx or Freud, not the modernity of Bach and Beethoven and Mozart, but the painter, Leonardo da Vinci. Of course, Leonardo da Vinci only completed, at least what we have, maybe 10 paintings. Most of what Leonardo began, he never completed. But what he had were, well, what we have from him at that time are 7,000 pages of reflections, descriptions, diaries of his interest in what Du Bois called experimental science. So the question is, how do we explain a person who produced works of art that for the European world and for the Renaissance, such as the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, humanizing European man and woman, how does this man in Du Bois's articulation become, as Du Bois will say, the founder of experimental science. Not Francis Bacon, who comes 100 years earlier, but Leonardo. Well, what this said to me, it said more about Du Bois than about Leonardo. And it said to me that Du Bois realized that the study of Black folk and the study of human beings, in this study, there had to be a philosophy of knowledge which linked science to art. I might have it wrong, but I feel strongly that I have discovered something that defines what Du Bois was doing. I've read and tried to read as carefully as possible as much of Du Bois as I can. I've tried to read as much of Marx as I can. And I mean, honestly, this is my passion. But I felt even though I saw something, I did not understand what I was seeing. So I go back, I rethink and relook at his doctoral dissertation, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade to the United States, 1638 to 1870. Now that's a question in itself. 1870, I thought it ended in 1865. But Du Bois, but that's another thing. I'm looking at it, and I see this chapter, the 7th chapter, on the Haitian Revolution. Now, this is a dissertation. He's doing it under a man named William Bushnell Hart, the leading historian at Harvard, who thought to do history and to find the truth of historical realities, you need to collect all the facts in the world. You know, so he had file cabinets with facts upon facts upon facts, but little knowledge. You needed more than facts. But Du Bois takes this imaginative leap, certainly for the 1890s, that the Haitian Revolution, as much as or more than the English abolitionist movement, was a critical and decisive part of ending or reducing the intensity of the transatlantic slave trade. So already we have in his work the centrality of the African human being in his and her own liberation. Now, this is in the 1890s. But then I look at his Philadelphia Negro, which is a word close to me because I'm from Philadelphia. And the first originary work of modern sociology, certainly of urban sociology, and I would recommend, it's unsurpassed even up to this day. You read it. Great literature. The man writes sociology like most people write novels. Very descriptive, very prose driven. But then you see in his own hand these charts, these maps, these surveys that he did. So along with the science is this art, almost like you would find in Leonardo's writing. You know, Leonardo would draw, because he was interested in anatomy, he would draw figures, and he would try to figure out the human form from the inside. So you get writing, diary, and um, drawing. So I'm saying, okay. And then I move on to the souls of Black folk. And I'm pushed back to this idea that Richard Wagner, the German uh, operatic composer, his idea of a complete work of art, complete work of art. And I'm looking at the souls of Black folk, and you should just look at it. The beginning, there's a poem, usually by a European thinker, and then there are bars from one of what he would call the sorrow songs, a Negro spiritual. So already you have poetry and music. But then you have, of course, Du Bois's great uh, literary work and his uses of irony and metaphor. You know, the color line is a metaphor. The veil is a metaphor, you know, and then he's considered one of the great ironists. Uh, and so you have all of that. But then you have short stories. So I'm saying this is as close to a complete work of art that you will get in a social science text. So I'm getting closer to what I'm thinking now. And then finally, the great work, Black Reconstruction in America, where in some ways he brings it all together and puts it before the world. This work is a conclusion, although not an end, to a project that began in 1890. You see the epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge, as it were. You see the this discovery, and I put discovery for the world, of the revolutionary character of Black humanity, and I mean revolutionary. He will say in Black Reconstruction that never had so many workers been liberated from oppression as was the case in the emancipation of 4 million slaves. And he would compare it to the ways that European radicals and advocates of the class struggle had talked about events in European history. And he said these were minor events compared to the emancipation of 4 million slaves. And he would describe these events in world historic terms, a point that I want to return to. And he would say, not only was it the liberation of workers, because the first chapter is entitled The Black Worker. There's not another book, at least in English, and not in America, that begins with the Black worker. But then he will argue that in several states of the South, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Mississippi, there was a distinct possibility for the emergence of a dictatorship of the Black proletariat. He would talk of a general strike of the slaves, which broke the back of the Confederacy economically. These were bold assertions which are still being debated up to this day. This was a full acknowledgement, not only of the humanity of the African, but their revolutionary humanity and potentiality. And that, going forward, the future of this nation would rest upon their shoulders. This unsettles traditional Marxist theorizing. And there's nothing wrong with that. It had to be unsettled. I mean, a lot of people, it's like, if you question anything in the King James version of the Bible, you are a sinner. So for Marx, he is thus a sinner. He has sinned against the foundations of Marxism, as it were. But without his recognition of the unity of art and science, and hence a new way of knowing the world, he could never have arrived at these conclusions. Du Bois represented, therefore, a great leap forward in knowledge, a great leap forward in our ability to imagine a revolutionary future for this country and the world, even in the darkest of times. Even in the and these are dark times, by the way. A great leap forward in a time of the crisis of U.S. empire, which, if U.S. empire is brought down, the whole world that comes out of European modernity has to rethink its position vis-a-vis humanity itself. And really, for the first time, European modernity, with all of its great achievements and with all of its great crimes, and with all of its narcissism and egotism and self-celebration. Oh God, I mean, how much of it can we take, man? You talk about black pride, it's nothing compared to, quote, white pride. But the European world will be forced to reconsider its relationship to humanity. And as Baldwin asks or says, the white man must rethink whiteness if he is to become human in the ways that the rest of humanity is human. And the question is not, are black people human any longer, but can white people be human and be white at the same time? My last point. Why is Du Bois so important? I know that we can, as we should, celebrate him. We should read his work. Let me just suggest reading and understanding his work is not as easy as you might think. I think his importance rests with a conception that he had of Leonardo. In this essay, and I recommend it to you, he says that Leonardo began a new movement of world thought. A new movement of world thought, which is another way of saying that Leonardo, if not the single founder, a major founder of what we call modernity. Just to, if I might just parenthetically say, it is popular these days to dismiss European modernity. There was not always a European modernity. But European modernity is an axial age, what we call an axial age. The axis of human civilization shifts. And for more than 500 years, maybe close to 1,000 years, we have this ascendancy of European modernity. Not singularly. There's still Africa, there's still China, there's still India, there's still the Aztecs, the Incas, all of that. But over historical time, through science and art and thought, a new axis of human civilization is achieved. There is no serious revolutionary. I don't care whether it's Lenin or Mao or Ho Chi Minh or Frederick Douglass or W.E.B. Du Bois, who would say, in order for us to be revolutionary, we have to reject all of science, all of art, all of philosophy that is associated with European modernity. What they will say is that Chinese modernity, Indian modernity, African modernity, African American modernity must champion a new freedom, which does not negate in the infantile way of throwing away, but in the advanced scientific way of embracing and going forward and beyond. But that going beyond has to be grounded in new thought, in the same way that the modern world coming out of the European Renaissance, and in particular Leonardo da Vinci, and as Du Bois assigns him, the inventor of a new movement of world thought in the 20th century, we can say that as we enter a new epoch in the struggle for modernity, Du Bois is the originary figure in a new movement of world thought. It is with the banner of Du Bois that we all march to the future. Du Bois is our future. Okay, not alone, of course. None of this is achieved alone or singularly by one person. But if we are to locate to the best of our capacity that originary thinker of a new movement of world thought, for reasons that I've tried to present, and I could go further. But if we are to identify that moment and that person, it is the beginning of the 20th century, and it is W.E.B. Du Bois. Hence, the statement that he makes first in 1900 at a Pan-African conference in London, and then he repeats in The Souls of Black Folk. The problem of the modern world is the problem of race, the oppression of the darker races of the world. That is the start of a new moment, a new moment. And then it reaches in a lot of ways its high point with Black Reconstruction in America. That the fulfillment of the new epoch of modernity will only come about with a revolution that changes the terms of the relationship between the white world to the darker races of humanity. There's just one small thing, if you don't mind. To discover and creatively expand upon Du Bois, we cannot look to university professors. You just can't. It's like, you want a horse that can beat all the others. You don't go to horses that have been kept in a stable and fed well and are overweight. You have to go among those whose lives depend upon ideas. And you know, when we think about it, I think about my own life, my own experience. You know, so many of us in the revolutionary movement have trivialized people. Oh, all they're interested in is doing, overturning or rioting, like the Chicago riot was of 1968 was not the greatest event in the history of Chicago. Maybe a great event, but not the greatest event. It is the day-to-day organizing of the Ida B. Wellses and the Margaret Burroughs and Charlie Burroughs and other people that I know from here. It is that day-to-day work to change the consciousness of the people, to educate the people. And that's where we are today in a great ideological struggle. University professors are going to be of little help. It will be the work of people who are committed and have a love for the people, not for money, as King said. And so I would propose today that we have a great challenge, a great opportunity to develop creatively, thinking for our common future. And the anchor of that is to be found in W.E.B. Du Bois and a new movement of world thought. Thank you.
Right, so we do have about a half an hour for question and answer. So feel free to raise questions for Dr. Monteiro, give your thoughts. Only request is please try to speak up because we are trying to record to get all this on our live stream. So yeah, anyone like to start? Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I always see a lot of so nice to see you. Good to see you as well. I didn't know whether we all were going to come. We're here. We're here. You know, so I went to Howard University, and that was back in the 70s. And so there was a lot of talk about W.E.B. and Booker T. And in terms of the relationship between the modernity of both, I've always been a little confused because, at least in this modern stage, I always interpreted Booker T as more theorist that we should have more skills, whereas W.E.B. worked more on like intellectualism, and I see both of those working in conjunction today. So would you say that both at this time actually are achieving the new modern? I don't know if I'm expressing myself correctly. And in fact, my understanding.
You know, I was always so pro Du Bois, and his chapter in Souls of Black Folk on Booker T, that I could not see very much positive in Booker T. Washington. In fact, I'm still, but not as much, the same position towards Garvey and Du Bois. And I think I would agree with you that all three were trying to figure out a way forward in the modern world, dominated by Europe. But, I think, and this is what I would say, that the task was not a matter of achieving practical outcomes necessarily, although that's always important. Tuskegee was important. The UNIA was important as a mobilizer, a raising of consciousness movement. But then there was something deeper and larger. And I think at that juncture, it is Du Bois who sees the future in the achievement of a new level of thinking and consciousness, and who saw the future in relationship to the past, if you understand, and not just the past of our suffering, which is huge, but the ideological past of art, of science, of medicine, of all of these things, which had been the crowning glory of European modernity. And none of us, when we think about it, wants to throw all of that away. But there is another future, and that is what Du Bois saw. And I think in this time of crisis, we must not only know the immediacy of the crisis, but we must have a future. And I think that future is in large part connected to a movement of thinking, a movement of consciousness, because great ideas become a force in the history of consciousness when they're connected to ordinary people. And that's when everything gets really beautiful. If you think about it, I know Minister Abel would agree with me on this. When you have an idea and you're enthusiastic about it, when you can connect what you're thinking, what you're studying, to the ordinary working person, the poor person, then something beautiful comes about. I think we're in such a moment. Mm-hmm. And because I think, if you think about our people, you go back 50, 60 years ago, the great civil rights movement, unparalleled, and the role of Chicago, the beauty of Chicago. That's why I don't recognize Chicago. I don't hardly recognize Philadelphia these days because the movement is not there. There is a waiting. Let's wait and see. We don't know. Who can we trust? That's the way Black people think, by the way. Who can we trust? And so on. We've elected these Black mayors, and we got one here, we got one in Philadelphia. And they never do anything for the ordinary person, but have a street named after somebody. You know how I'm thinking? But anyway, you know where I'm coming from. But it is the intellectual. And by the intellectual, I'm not talking about the university professor. There's a difference between an intellectual and a careerist. Anyway, I won't go too deeply into that. But yeah, that's the way I would see it these days. And I agree with the way you put it.
One of the points that you made in your lecture, and which you've expanded on in some of your other talks, is the way that Du Bois wanted to not renounce historical laws, but rather to say it's in conjunction with chance and the subjective factor. And one of the things that Black Reconstruction raised, which I guess upset certain Orthodox Marxists, was the fact that, number one, he talked about the enslaved African as a worker, number one. But then the other thing, this is something I find very interesting, is that he also describes Reconstruction as at least taking the first steps toward dictatorship of the proletariat, right? And so not only are the freedmen playing a role in overthrowing this outmoded system of production, the chattel slavery system, but they also are taking steps toward a system that is even more advanced in capitalism. And they took those steps when the industrial proletariat of the North had failed to do, So I guess, and of course, that offends sort of the rigid stagism of Marxism, that you have to go through industrial capitalism and then socialism, etc. Since industrial capitalism did not exist, so to speak, in the South at that time. But I think what's so interesting is that so much of modern history has borne that out, because look at arguably the most successful model of socialism in the world today is China, and that was a socialist revolution peasants, not the industrial proletariat, and then they created the industrial proletariat in China after the communist recovery. So anyway, this is my long-winded way of saying, so what do you think in terms of insights for today and understanding a revolutionary transformation, that how does that rejection of sort of crude stagism, I guess, I don't see it so much as a rejection of Marxism as rather a enrichment of Marxism. So how do you see that as informing our understanding of like how the transition will occur to a different system?
It's a question that's being discussed by a lot of young people, many of whom saw Bernie Sanders as the hope of a socialist movement, and then he betrayed them. And so many of them, especially white youth, have gone to a form of communism, Marxism, Leninism, and such. I can understand it because I was at one time their age, and but I think that's why I refer to Du Bois as a prequel. Du Bois was a scientist. He stated on so many occasions that Marx was the greatest European philosopher. He was a champion of the Russian Revolution and Lenin and Stalin and the attempt to build socialism, as well as a real champion of the Chinese Revolution, because he saw the darker nations, as he called them, as being decisive to the real revolutionary transformation of the world. I agree with everything you say, but I think that as a originator of a new movement of world thought, he is in substance a prequel to Marx. In other words, Du Bois explains Marx better than almost any Marxist do. Mm-hmm. Now, this is something that would take some time to substantiate. The Marxist achievement was of a certain period in a certain space in time. It did not see the world as such. And in a lot of ways, it looked back to the great philosophical and scientific achievements of Europe. Mm-hmm. A lot of people say, well, Marx was more into Hegel, yes, but he was also into Kant, and that's another story. But it was the 19th century. It was the beginning of the 19th century with the French Revolution. So that is what grounds Marx and his followers. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? No problem. Not enough. And that is why a new movement of world thought, and I think that understanding Du Bois in this way, he explains both Marx and the absences in Marx. When I say explain, he didn't write a exegesis, a long drawn out book or essay on Marx and what was wrong with Marx and so on. But his practice, his theoretical and philosophical, and then his practical work in the struggle, his idea of Pan-Africanism, his idea of the unity of Pan-African, Pan-Asia, his idea that the revolution, as you said, the revolutionary energy would emerge from Asia. And he therefore said Africa learned from Asia when he went to China in 1959. So for Marx, When he tried to, he couldn't because he didn't have the evidence, the knowledge, the experience. He would call the entirety of Asian economic social life as the Asiatic mode of production. Well, he was trying to get at something, but I think if you take a great thinker like Marx, he was aware of his limitation. He studied, at the end of the day, the British factory system. Now, how universal was that? So there were weaknesses. And I think that the great German philosophers were both a manifestation of the potential of European modernity, but at the same time, a reflection of its profound weaknesses and how, in the future, or in our time and in this crisis, it is not adequate. That's, and I think there's evidence for that, and I think, well, yeah, I'll just stop there. Yes.
Dr. Monteiro, thank you very much for the lecture.
And thank you very much for coming. He's a monk. Yeah. Benedict monk.
I really was intrigued by your distinguishing between the intellectual and the careerist, and how the academy is not going to receive someone like this. My question is, how, in your opinion, your suggestion? I'm sorry. In your opinion and your suggestions, how might this modern intellectual promote herself or himself in our age? And I'm not talking about performance and politics. Speaking for 24 hours. I'm talking about intellectual. How and what avenues exist, in your opinion, for that intellectual outside of the academy to promote herself and himself for the Reconstruction project? For the what? For the reconstruction of our community.
Well, I think, as you attest by your career, and by the way, we just met. But there have to be those real intellectuals who may have gone through academic careers, who commit what one thinker called class suicide.
Yeah.
By that, we mean the ambition of rising to the top of a dying institution, which I mean university. And in so doing, one makes a sacrifice, but one discovers life and purpose. And in that sense, the intellectual is like the artist, an artistic sensibility. And the academic becomes an intellectual, becomes a revolutionary, discovers her and his purpose, and that there is a purpose, and does not, connect himself or herself to this death called postmodernism and all of their theories, and does not become an agent thereby of oppression in general, but oppression of Black people in particular. And that's what I think. It's an act of self-realization and an act of courage. It is a break with the ideas and practices of the American ruling elite and their crumbling empire. And there's nothing wrong with expressing complete and utter contempt for it, these institutions, and everybody connected to it, or attempts to obscure the reality of it. You know what I'm saying? This cowardice in the name of, well, I'm going to do my work and at least I'm doing something. You're not doing that much. And, most of what you're doing is about you. And this narcissism, you don't want me to start talking about it. I was there. I've been there, did that. But yeah, you see where I'm coming from. But it is the revolutionary task. And, Du Bois talked, he was famous for the idea of a talented tenth, which was not a lot of people say, oh, he's talking about the boule. I don't even know where do they have an office? But anyway, he was down with the boule. I know he was an alpha, but anyway, but he said those who had most to give should be morally committed to giving it to the freedom of their people. He first said it was 10% of the population, which should not abandon its people, but try to find ways to help the lower 90%. But then in 1948, he abandoned the talented tenth concept, and he said the talented tenth had become consumed in universal selfishness. Well, they're really acting that out on a huge, to an embarrassing level these days. And he therefore said, the leading force among Black people would be a guiding 100, rather than 1 out of 10, 1 out of 100. And I think that's where we're at.
He's very well read, well spoken. And I came in kind of late, so very well read. I said he's very well read and very, very well spoken. And I missed the first 30 minutes or so. And, I've read, more importantly, not just read, I've thought about what I read. It ain't just what you read. I said, it's not so much what you read, what you think about.
Yes.
And I may differ with some of what you said earlier, but it's not just what you think, it's what you do. It's important that you act on what you call your knowledge, your understanding, your consciousness. So one of the things I'm curious about, I want to pose to you for your consideration, is whatever you read and what you talked about today about the boys, how can you suggest applying that, the ideas, the perspective, to help us move forward as people of color in the competitive world we have today? What is the message that we want to share with each other, and we want to tell our generations that are coming up under us, I'm an elder in this community, what is it we want to tell them, to move forward with passion? And some of what I think sometimes we need to review what happened in the late 1960s, 1970s, and update it some, but push that back out to the community. It's ridiculous. I used to give a simple thing. You can tell that you're moving into an African American community, most of our metropolitan areas, by the amount of trash that's on the street. To me, it says something about our consciousness, our self-worth, and sense of self-esteem, that we litter our communities so easily. But there's something about Black pride. I came up from that era that one reason I didn't get all off into drugs or abuse other women, young women and stuff like that, because I bought into that we were in a struggle. We were in a struggle, and it's important that we honor and we treat each other with respect.
This is very important. And
I'm
sorry.
So anyway, let me try to bring that back home, which is, but when we leave here today, what would be your message for us to take to other people who weren't here today to help the community move forward in a positive way, and to come up with, how do we strategize to deal with the barriers and the resistance that we run into every day? Thank you.
It's going to be a difficult struggle. Since the time of our great movement for civil rights and Black power movements, the ruling elite have targeted us as a people and our youth in particular. I refer to it often as cognitive manipulation, cognitive and cultural manipulation. Sometimes our young people don't even have a chance given the culture that is foisted upon them and what the schools do and don't do. Their parents have lost even the ability to parent them, even when they try, because their force is so large against them. But I think we have to, one, assess this new moment in history. When I say assess, I don't mean spend the next 2 years, reading documents.
Describing the problem.
Yeah, seeing where we are in history. I think I tried to do that today. Secondly, to understand what, and I put a high level of importance on the achievement of ideological clarity. And that is not, some detail of this or that theory, but the clarity about the moment, about the crisis, and about the possibilities of the future. We can teach that to our people. The other thing is, nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come. I think what I tried to talk about today is a manifestation of an idea whose time has come. Now, how all of this will manifest itself concrete is difficult to say. But I know in Philadelphia, where I've committed most of my political life and working in an activist life and so on, I continue to see signs, like there's a time for seeding and there's a time for harvesting. I think we're in a time for seeding, but the harvest is not far off. I think it is with that confidence that we can go forward. If you ask me for roadmap, for a lot of people, I'm sorry, Minister Abel left, a great man, by the way, the Nation of Islam. I highly respect their work. And, by the way, their theology. I think the only place, or main, for the most part, the place where you're going to find liberation theology is in the Nation of Islam. Too many Christian churches have abandoned the very idea in return for crumbs off the table of the elites in the Democratic Party in particular. If I were to make one suggestion, I guess concretely, keep these politicians out of the church. Number one. But with the Nation of Islam, I know in Philadelphia, we have other kinds of organizations. Churches, of course, art movement, youth movements, and there are all kinds of cross currents. And we all know it out here in Chicago. Too much violence, too much gentrification. In fact, I don't recognize Chicago, South Side no more. Well, where are the black folk at? Really, it's really tragic for me. And it has not happened to us in Philadelphia like they've done y'all here. Really, but anyway, that's another story. But I think those of us who will become and wish to be the vanguard of our people, we must learn and study. That's the seed. Those seeds will bloom and will harvest. But we're in a time where it's not going to happen like it did before. Where you remember how we would talk about self-determination for the black community? Well, I don't think that concept works so well these days because we're talking about a larger thing. And I'll tell you why I don't think, I wouldn't go too far with this. What black people have produced is not just for black people. The world has embraced it. Our art, our music, our ideas. In fact, I would even suggest to you that a presentation like this might get a better hearing in the People's Republic of China than it does in Chicago right now. So we have become a world historic force by the nature of our art and our ideas and our resistance, our Muhammad Ali's, our Martin Luther King's, our Malcolm X, Honorable Elijah Muhammad. These figures have influenced the trajectory of world history, of world humanity. You know, in the free school, I have all of these young people, and they're not my students, they're my peers, by the way. And I ain't saying that just to say something. India, Korea, Pakistan, and black folk. Derek Black folk, Black Chicago. But why is this? And we're 14 years old. It wasn't always like this. Why are we now looking at the formation of world houses? Of a world house. You know, if the Nation of Islam open up their doors tomorrow, more white people be rushing in there than you could, because our struggle represents something to world humanity. And so it is not just our struggle anymore. Our music is not just our music. It belongs to humanity. It belongs to the ages. I think that's, and of course, it's going to be difficult because we're under the hammer. And our young people have been, oh, I'm sorry, I talked too much.
Well, I was just saying that.
Oh, let me let her come in. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, man. I'm sorry.
No problem.
I mentor young people, high school students, and young adults in Chicago, on the north side of what you call the hood. And my question for you, Dr. Monteiro, as like a scholar, a teacher, how do we, these young people, they're going to these schools where some of them are learning nothing. Some of them are learning nothing at all in the studies, or they're just getting kind of passed along. So how do we introduce these young people who've never heard the word modernity, who've never heard of Google or any of these other people?
Absolutely.
How do we start them at a base level?
If you don't mind, I hear you, and these are the deep pedagogical questions. Paulo Freire, the pedagogy of the oppressed. Every revolution has had to deal with the youth, educating the youth, convincing the youth of the future. Because if you don't win the youth will be used against the movement. You know what I'm saying? Not knowing that they're being used against progress. And I don't have the answer. But that is what we must discover. And young people don't dislike learning, they dislike school. And here in Chicago, I am not at all impressed with the teachers who are not, oh, I'm sorry, forgive me.
These schools are very similar to prisons.
Absolutely. We did this past year celebrating the 100th anniversary of the birth of James Baldwin, all throughout Philadelphia reading groups. And in South Philadelphia High School, which I know would be so familiar to any teacher, any parent here in Chicago. And we had a group, it started with about 5 or 6, whittled down to 3 young men. And Alice, they asked the young men, each one by one, why do you want to read Baldwin? And one young guy, about 15 years old, said, because I want to live. I don't want to die. And that's the tragedy. They do want to learn. They do want to live. They do want to struggle. And we have to find, you would know much better than me. I am It is very mission. This huge tragedy of our young people. All they give them is sports and rap. I mean, how do you not teach our young kids Duke Ellington? I mean, even if you don't know it all or don't like it in the beginning, at least you know what great music is. This is intentional. But the good side of it is that this is a ruling class that can't rule. And the people recognize this and refine their own way. You know, just my last small point, I guess we have to end. It's a sign of something when black people no longer support black politicians. Y'all know where I'm coming from. In Philadelphia, most black people don't have nothing to do with it. Nothing to, or the different elites who try to promote them. I think that's the case in Chicago, if I read the polls correctly. But yeah, this is a sign. And just like that young man said, I want to live. Well, I want to thank you all for coming out.
Thank you again for your insightful words. So many questions to ask you. And please let us do a big, big round of applause. And please use this opportunity from the words that we've learned, the questions that were asked, to think about ways that we can take this information and share it with others. Again, on behalf of the African American Heritage Committee, my name is Tina Carter, and I want to thank you all for coming out here at the beautiful Chicago B branch. And remember, all of the programs that Chicago Public Library offers, you can find them on our website, www.chipubLIB.org. Thank you again. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Please have a wonderful rest of the day.
Please do write your name on our sign-in sheet so we can stay in touch and hopefully